Thank you everyone for coming this evening. We've got a series of 4 events looking at Palestinian art and architecture, and the events are taking place in different institutions across London, so different architecture and art schools across London. This is the second of the series of 4. The next one is on the 20th of May, I think it is, and that will be the artist Dima Suruji, who will be in conversation with Zoe Whiteley, who's the director of the Chisholm Gallery. That will be at the London School of Architecture, and then the last event in this series is going to be June the 17th, and that is going to be Jumana Boazir, who works with forensic architecture, and she will be in conversation with Alison Killing, who is the Financial Times Special Investigations unit. So she does quite a lot of work on forensic architectural investigations as well herself. But it's great to be able to start this evening's event, and it's fantastic to have Rachel Dedman with us today. Rachel is the Jamil Curator for Contemporary Art from the Middle East at the V&A. And prior to her post at the V&A, she was working in Beirut as a curator, working at the Palestinian Museum. And she's going to be talking about Palestinian embroidery and the work that she's been doing for the last 10 years on the subject, looking at the kind of history and trajectory and traditions and political implications of Palestinian embroidery. Her exhibition, Material Power, was at Kettle's Yard, Cambridge, and then it moved to the Whitworth in Manchester, and it's just finished there. And I mean, when I visited the exhibition, I was struck by the narrative that was being told, which is about not only the history of Palestinian embroidery, tatreez, and the way in which the examples that were being shown from the late 19th, early 20th century, and how the practice of embroidery was very specifically located to towns and villages across Palestine. And how that was affected and disrupted by the occupation and the events after 1948, and then how the practice of embroidery gained a whole other significance and meaning after that time, and then also impacted not only by displacement and the movement of people, but also by modernity, by new technologies. And so the exhibition really kind of like gave this very enriched overview of the practice and the tradition and how it's changed across time. And I think Rachel tonight is going to talk about the work that she's been doing behind that exhibition. I think she's going to show some of the exhibition, some sort of photographs of it. But it's really the kind of research work that has fed into that show. After her presentation, after the talk, she's going to be in conversation with Usman Yusufzada. Usman is an incredibly prolific artist, works across a range of different disciplines, media, whether it be painting, textiles, fabrics. He has a number of exhibitions going on at present. He's currently exhibiting in Venice. His show at Charleston has just ended, and there's one opening in Bradford very soon, I think, as well. And I don't think I can keep up with all the work that's on at the moment, or where it's on. And he's also he works in the academic fields. I've got his academic credentials, I want to make sure to get this. Okay. Yeah, no, it's great. No. What is it? Professor of Interdisciplinary Practice at the Birmingham School of Art, and visiting fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge University, and research practitioner at the Royal College of Art. And not just in terms of, his work is not just in terms of these kind of academic credentials and exhibitions, but it looks very closely at experiences of migration, and of identities and of movement, and his book, The Go-Between, explores this as a memoir as well. So it's very much works in so many different ways. I'm finished yet. So the point being, I'm looking forward. I think this is going to be like a great conversation as well between the two artists, well, curator and artist. And I should probably just hand over, I think, because I could go on about Rachel, but I probably shouldn't. So let me hand over to Rachel and welcome.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, very good evening, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak to you tonight about material power, about the history and contemporary life of Palestinian embroidery, and about relationships between dress and practices of resistance. Can you hear me okay? Is this in the right place? Yeah, good. At this time of genocide in Gaza, when relentless horrors are unfolding in front of our eyes still every single day, in the face of incredible human loss and collective trauma, I think speaking about clothing can potentially feel unimportant or indeed sort of superficial. But as I hope tonight will make clear, and I'm sure as many of you already know and feel, tatreez, or embroidery, is more than heritage. In Palestine, it is Palestinian life. Although it constitutes the very humblest of gestures, the repetitive binding of thread to fabric, at the core of the practice, embroidery embodies resilience. And for those who didn't see the exhibition, Material Power explored well over a century of Palestinian embroidery, dress, and material culture. The show celebrated embroidery's rich traditions, as Shah had mentioned, and explored the ways in which it transformed over time, bringing together garments, archival material, commissioned film, as well as the work of contemporary artists, exploring embroidery's continued capacity as a creative and critical medium today. Material Power grew out of a decade of work I've been doing on this subject. In 2013, a long time ago now, the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit in the West Bank commissioned me to curate a show on Palestinian embroidery in Beirut. They asked me because I had the privilege of passports that enabled me to travel between Lebanon and Palestine. And I was living and working mainly in Beirut in that moment. And that first exhibition, At the Seams, in 2016, then birthed an expanded, updated edition entitled Labour of Love, at the Palestinian Museum's main site in Birzeit in 2018. And these are the covers of the books that we produced for the show. From the very beginning of my research, it felt imperative to approach and understand the craft as something alive and active, not confined to history. I commissioned Maeve Brennan, an artist with a similar privilege of mobility, who was also living in Lebanon at the time, to film the interviews that I was conducting with women at the time, who lived all over Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, who were continuing to embroider today, and from whom I wanted to learn not only about the craft, but indeed about their relationship to the practice in the present. And these films, stills of which you see in front of you, bring Palestinian women's voices into the core of the exhibition. They're sort of woven throughout it and offer that contemporary perspective on historical material. Notions of resistance loomed very large for us from the beginning. Embroidery has perhaps an unlikely role in the charged context of resistance. And yet, in both loud and quiet ways, in public and in private, the history of the craft is bound up, I think, in Palestinian struggles for freedom and nationhood. I argue that embroidery, in symbolic as much as in physical form, has played a fundamental role in the articulation of Palestinian nationalism after 1948. And for me, resistance is also a lens through which to understand it in the present. As Sophia Graham, whom we met in Ain Helwa camp in Lebanon, put it, folklore is a politics unto itself. It means that I exist. I'm going to walk you through some of the core themes and objects of material power and the ideas and research that underpin them. My work, above all, seeks to understand and to frame Palestinian embroidery as a continually evolving practice, from the 19th century right through to today. Made by people and worn on the body, clothing is inevitably embedded in the political, social, and economic dynamics of its time, and in the emotional life of its maker. And so for me, embroidery offers us, above all, an intimate vehicle for unfolding a human history of place. So what is Palestinian embroidery? Embroidery, or tatreez, is Palestine's preeminent cultural practice, its most famous product. Palestinian embroidered dress is best known in its most spectacular form through the festive wedding and occasion dresses that women would spend years embroidering from their girlhood onwards. But material power opens not with those dresses, but with garments that are perhaps not usually written about or collected or shown in exhibition. The humbler dresses that were worn every day. And for me, these everyday garments capture how we might think about all Palestinian embroidery as material evidence of rural women's lives in that late 19th, early 20th century period, and indeed as fundamentally mutable things. On this dress, the traces of the maker's labour are visible on the very garment. There are two breast patches, I don't know how well you can see them, sort of either side of the chest panel, that indicate how she would have breastfed her baby while working in the fields without having to pull the whole garment up, and these have then been sewn closed permanently once the baby was weaned. The patches at her elbows and this large section across the knees indicate how she might have knelt to work clay, to wash vegetables, to clean clothes. In my mind's eye, I sort of imagine her day in and day out wiping wet hands on soft linen and wearing the fabric away to threads until it needed to be replaced. In this image, you see that same dress turned inside out that gives you a full sense of the kind of mosaic, patchwork, palimpsestic nature of these kinds of garments and their construction and evolution over time. On this everyday dress, you can see on the veneer at the side panels the ways in which the embroidery has been bleached by the sun over long exposure to light. The once bright red thread is becoming duller in places. And on the back here, you can see this sort of brighter panel at the bottom indicates that the handwriting of the embroiderer is different here. One section is sort of bolder, bigger stitches than the other, and on a different base of linen. Perhaps the woman who owned this dress inherited an older garment from a mother or a grandmother, discarded the parts that were worn out, and then incorporated it onto an existing base. I find such humble garments incredibly compelling because such clothing resists the notion of a definitive museum object that has a singular time, a particular origin, a singular maker. Rather, these everyday dresses would transform materially over time, passing into other hands. I love the idea that a dress might start life in one form and over several decades have so much added to it or patched up or removed that by the end, if there is an end, not one stitch of that is original, and yet it remains the same garment. For me, these everyday dresses are the perfect place to start because they remind us to approach all embroidery as mutable and adaptive, changing alongside the women who wear them. I like to talk and to think about embroidery as a rich visual language, one that was spoken and shared by women. In Palestine, the way that you dressed, what you put on your body, the way you made your embroidery spoke to your character, your identity, and above all, your origins. Indeed, partly, I think what makes Palestinian embroidery remarkable is the regional variety, with each area, even individual villages, having their own approach to dress, their own particular motifs, cuts, colours, use of textiles, and so on. Dress changed over the course of a woman's life. These are two garments from sort of either ends of the spectrum. In childhood, girls would learn to embroider at a very young age, perhaps at 5 or 6, and begin practicing embroidery to create a trousseau of garments and pillowcases that they would take with them into marriage. And then at the very end of your life, your dress and embroidery became simpler and more austere to reflect your maturity. The wedding was the most important rite of passage of a woman's lifetime, and her embroidered wedding dress was perhaps the most special thing she owned, maybe the only thing she took with her, fleeing into exile. the forest of dresses, as we called it, you saw before and which you glimpsed behind in the exhibition, brought together examples from all over Palestine of these sort of celebration wedding garments. And to give you just a couple of examples of some of these specific places, the area of Hebron in central southern Palestine is associated with the motif you see here repeated, called the Khayam al-Basha, or Pasha's tent, seen here on this Rudfe head covering, and which speaks to the inspiration that women would get from flora and fauna, from architecture, from political events. Maybe an Ottoman caravan came through at some point in the 19th century and came up with this motif, or rather the women were inspired to come up with it. The dense cross-stitch embroidery that you see here in pinks and reds is perhaps most typical of the Palestinian style. And this, we know, is a dress from Hebron, although with some references to the town of Beit Dajan, because of the silk patchwork up the front of the skirt. And typically the front of these jalea would sort of flap open as a woman walked. You would see a skirt or trousers underneath. But in the British Mandate period, which began in 1918, conventions of modesty in Palestine became more conservative, with the result that women would sew up the slits in their jalea or button them closed. And you can see in the dress on the right, again, this is the same garment turned inside out, that there are buttons there to close it, but to sort of retain that eponymous style. And the garment speaks to the ways in which clothing reflects always the shifting socio-political dynamics of its day. Women from Bethlehem, meanwhile, were famous for couching, for tahriri, an embroidery technique that involves laying thick cord on top of a garment in twisted patterns, often with gold or silver thread. And this tatsiri jacket would have been worn over a velvet dress, like this one, or over one with sort of fluted sleeves. And Bethlehem was a popular pilgrimage town whose visitors boosted the local economy, of course. This prosperity was reflected in that richness of Bethlehemite dress. You can also see, both in the lining of that jacket and here at the bottom of this dress, the use of British cottons. This was a nod to her status. Women would include imported British cotton to show they could afford to do so. This would have kind of kicked up behind her as she walked, or you'd have it in the lining somewhere, just as a little, again, nod to their interest in fashion. Women based elsewhere might commission couched elements from Bethlehem, again, as a sign of status. This is a Ramallah dress with Bethlehem sleeves, indicating the presence of a cottage industry for certain types of Palestinian embroidery in this early 20th century period. And again, women's awareness and desire for style. I think we tend to think of tradition as somehow not the same as fashion, but of course this was fashion and totally dictated by it. In the Galilee up north, embroidery tended to be less dense, with a different style to the patterning of the stitchwork, and women tended to wear coats of this kind. This one's sort of red with black velvet, accompanied by shirts or shirwal pants. And local dress tended to require or rely less upon embroidery than on extraordinary textiles from Aleppo and Damascus, such as this stunning ikat silk, because of the Galilee's proximity to Syria. The last one I wanted to highlight is Gaza, known for its use of vibrant pinks and a sort of sparser, more geometric approach to embroidery. This V-shaped neckline is really typical and includes a motif called the kalade, the necklace, which meant that the embroidery acted as a sort of permanent jewellery. And such jewellery would traditionally serve a talismanic function. For me, there's something very beautiful, poetic, and tragic about the ancestors of today's Gazan women carrying on their body this sort of permanent protective power. These were just a few examples of the unique dresses and styles of embroidery that you find all over Palestine. As I mentioned, embroidery was very much a rural women's craft, as middle and upper class Palestinians had, by the middle of the 19th century, long adopted Ottoman or European dress. But this unusual garment sort of complicates that class distinction, and this is something we explore in the show. This is a buttery soft silk slip dress. It's sleeveless, but you'd wear over it this little jacket on top, very much in European style. and embroidered with Palestinian motifs. And this was bought by a woman called Basma Kawad on her honeymoon in 1921 from Nazareth. It's interesting because, again, it indicates that there's perhaps a small market and indeed small local industry in Palestine catering to the well-to-do in this period, offering these sort of tasteful, traditional touches to modern fashion for those who would otherwise have almost nothing to do with rural communities and their dress. This image, meanwhile, looks at first glance like a Palestinian rural family captured in their traditional dress, but it's actually an upper-class Palestinian family who live in Jerusalem and have visited a photo studio and played dress-up in Falahi costume. And for me, this is a reminder that a thobe, an embroidered dress, is for one Palestinian woman the most precious thing she owns, again, maybe the only thing she takes with her later, but is for another Palestinian woman, well, just something to put on as costume in this kind of auto-orientalizing play. And these different objects, I think, remind us how complex and ever-changing relationships to clothing are, and the multiple ways in which class and embroidery intersect, and this sort of comes back, or will come back later. The events of 1948, which Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, changed the lives of everyone in Palestine. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly displaced from their homes by Zionist forces, and many were killed or injured in the battle to keep their land from dispossession and to fight ethnic cleansing. It feels very difficult to do justice to the full scale and horror and impact of the Nakba in facts and statistics. It feels too cold and impersonal somehow, especially while another Nakba unfolds before us. But this dress, for me, offers a sort of avenue into some of that experience or reality. This is a dress that we can tell by its cut and colour and motifs is from Ramallah, made by a woman from Ramallah who donated it to a woman who walked into the West Bank, having been displaced from her home within the 1948 borders, carrying with her perhaps nothing to wear except what she happened to have on. And so the woman who originally made this donated it to her, so she had something else to wear. But we can see that the person who inherited it must have been taller and bigger than the original embroiderer, as the garment has been enlarged. There's a panel sort of at the sides and around the waist that make it bigger. And the materiality of this is sacking from a bag of flour issued to refugees in the aftermath of the crisis by UNRWA, the UN Refugee Works Agency. And you can just about make out here the tail end of the letter Nun from the word tahin, or flour, that was sort of stamped on the side of this sack in UN blue. And so for me, the very fabric of the garment speaks not only to the urgency of the situation, but indeed to the generosity and resilience of women, especially one to another, at what must have been the most difficult time of their lives. In Material Power, I show this garment near a contemporary artwork by the artist Aya Haidar, whom some of you may know. Her Safe Space series documents her mother's memories of growing up during the civil war in Lebanon, and the simple everyday actions that her family took to stay safe. From a distance, I think these seem bright and playful, but as you come closer, you realise the stories they tell are actually quite dark. The family would sit on the sofa with pots and pans on their heads to protect from stray bullets that would fly in through the windows. They slept under their beds for months at a time in case the roof caved in during an air raid. They would wear pan lids on their torsos to go and visit the market as these kind of makeshift bulletproof vests. Her grandmother got so annoyed at having to constantly pull glass from the shattered windows out of the furniture that they just kind of piled all the furniture up in the middle of the room and would sit on the carpet. While these works are ostensibly about a different conflict, although geopolitically, of course, they're all intrinsically connected, for me, these simple stitched scenes capture, just like the dress, that lived experience of conflict, and speak to the ability of embroidery and textiles to bear witness, to hold memories, to tell stories, to constitute a form of quiet resistance in and of themselves. Embroidery after the Nakba, of course, did not die. It persisted and it transformed. The new dress, or the camp dress, some examples you see here, emerged as that regional variation eroded slowly when women were living together from all these different villages in the same camp or in exile together. The form of the dress homogenized, particularly into the 6-branch style that you see before you. And these dresses may not have the same richness of material or refinement of approach. They're not Syrian silk, they're Chinese polyester, and the motifs come from the magazines that the women who made them were reading in the 1980s and so on. For me, they still tell us something very important. They're compelling about the women who made them. It takes a very bold person to wear lime green with day glow orange. So I already feel I know something about this woman. And for me, they speak to the continued ability of embroiderers to renew and evolve the craft, and for clothing to speak to that change and transformation. At the same time, in the decades following 1948, there was a concerted revival of Palestinian traditional heritage, prompted in part by the appropriation and attempted erasure of Palestinian culture by the Israeli occupation. And in this process of the revival of heritage, the rural Falahi woman became symbolic of what I call the Palestinian pastoral. The rural female body became evidence of the historic presence of Palestinians on their land, symbolic of nature, longevity, purity, and always identified by her embroidered dress. The embroidered woman, as I call this figure, became a preeminent symbol in the decades that followed, and she was really popularized in Palestinian painting and in art. Artists in the 1970s took her up as a key figure in their work, including in this amazing piece by artist Vera Tamari, and many continue to do so today. This painting, The Village Awakens by Sleiman Mansour, is one of the most iconic paintings of modern Palestine. And here, the embroidered woman's body is blown up to the very scale of the landscape. The curves of her head and shoulders are continuous with the village and the rolling hills behind her. And then in a not super subtle metaphor, from between her legs rush forth a torrent of men mostly, but indeed people ready to toil the land and create culture. And so here the embroidered woman becomes the embodiment of generative fertility. She's literally the motherland. So on the one hand, such images signaled an important shift in value. For the first time, women who had had very little cultural visibility, it was always those middle and upper class Palestinian women who played a role, and even then limited, in Palestinian political life. The rural women who were practicing embroidery had very little space in that. And here, for the first time, they were featured large scale on paintings, but on the other hand, or at the same time, such images had this effect of reducing those women to a simplified signifier. These kinds of images began to circulate as posters from the 1970s onwards, both within Palestine and abroad. And embroidery sort of left the body and became part of this symbolic vocabulary for the nation, appearing alongside other key symbols, oranges from Jaffa or the city of Jerusalem. In these three posters, the peasant woman's body really becomes a literal extension of the land itself. I think I chose these because it's her hair each time that is sort of made continuous with it. The flag of the nation, the wheat she harvests, the body of other fighters and farmers, and so on. In this same period, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was pioneering the travel of exhibitions all over the world. And they took shows that included a lot of embroidery to Leipzig, to East Berlin, to Moscow, to Japan. And these exhibitions were backdrops to high-profile political meetings, often Yasser Arafat meeting the King of Spain, for example, taking the form of a kind of soft diplomacy. And such shows took embroidery into that international realm, out of its original context, instrumentalized in the public display of the nation. Back in Palestine, posters began to evolve over the course of the 70s and 80s. The embroidered woman figure retained the strength and tenderness of motherhood, but took on armed iconography at a time when the Palestinian resistance movement was building up ahead of the First Intifada, which was, as I'm sure you all know, a mass popular uprising against the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza from 1987 onwards. As young men were arrested or shot at protests, women took on a more visible role in frontline struggle during the First Intifada. And during this period, it was illegal to show Palestinian colours in public and to fly the Palestinian flag. So women started to stitch explicit symbols of resistance onto embroidered dresses, creating these Intifada dresses as we know them. And what you see in these is a mingling of traditional motifs, now rendered in Palestine's national colours, mingling among a new symbolic vocabulary. So in this one, you see this dove soaring across the chest panel, flanked by rifles, crossed swords, these two little birds, and the love heart. Architectural sites like the Dome of the Rock or Al-Aqsa Mosque begin to feature heavily, along with the map of Palestine, the words Palestine, both in English and Arabic, or signs of allegiance to political parties. So here, the letters PLO. On the one hand, such dresses are powerful personal garments, which render women's bodies these sites of explicit political resistance. But what is also extraordinary about them, for me, is that they feel so at odds with the material culture of protest as we might know it. You know, when we go to marches or demonstrations, I think on the whole we tend to make things quickly, a scrawled sign, maybe a printed poster, something we've graffitied. But these dresses, as anyone who has ever embroidered will know, take a really, really, really long time. These would have been months, if not years, in the making. Stitching is an incredibly slow and laborious process. And these would have been made under extremely difficult conditions, perhaps under siege with very little electricity. You had to sort of buy colours separately, independently, so you didn't draw attention to yourself if you were found with this in your house, and these were routinely raided. That would have been very problematic. So women worked hard in the making of them, and for me that extended temporality speaks to this idea of sumud, of steadfastness, that's so at the core of Palestinian resistance, and to the idea that resistance in Palestine is a process, not an event. Another context in which embroidery constitutes a form of resistance to both circumstance and the occupation is among men who practice embroidery while being held as political prisoners in Israeli jails. These lamps, these sort of lampshades, represent a collaboration between Noel, whom we met in Wallajah in Palestine, and her son Hamad, who's in prison. And they would sort of exchange these objects back and forth, embroidering them and making them together in this collaborative process. And at times when craft materials are allowed into Israeli prisons, prisoners make things that are more elaborate, crafts of all kinds. But when in periods when those are banned, which is frequent, objects become more improvised. Prisoners speak of hoarding olive stones for beading, for turning into prayer beads, using cereal box cardboard as the basis for stitching, smuggling needles into prison in the spines of books, and of pulling threads from their towels to use as thread. And what I love about these objects is that such work often displays a certain nationalism and pride. Again, you see Palestinian colours here, but they're also very much characterised by tenderness. Things made for wives, for daughters, for Mother's Day, for International Women's Day. You're looking here at work by my Palestinian Museum colleague, Karam al-Malouch, who made things mostly for his wife, Ala. These are their initials, either side of this little handbag, which he made out of reinforced cardboard that's then covered with this thin velvet and embroidered with what has become known as this prisoner stitch. And the resilience of such gestures and the sort of softness of their content, you could say, defy simplistic notions of embroidery as women's work and challenge its incompatibility with the masculine. Indeed, I think both resistance and embroidery tend to be gendered, but such objects trouble these distinctions and definitions, and suggest that while embroidery has, as we saw in those, like the painting and the ceramics, sort of contributed to the construction of certain gendered roles for women, it can also sort of mediate in their refusal. And as you see from this installation shot of one part of the show at the Whitworth, contemporary work sort of infused alongside all this material, the Intifada dresses, the prisoners' works too, and the work of Palestinian artist Khalil Rabah appears very much in this section. I wanted to talk briefly about just one work, Tattoo, in which Khalil took another symbol, very obvious symbol of resistance in textile, the keffiyeh, and removed the threads, the black threads that make up this kind of almost fisherman's net-like pattern in the middle of the textile. And despite the thread's removal, the outline of that pattern remains visible still, albeit kind of ghostly. The symbol, even if it has been defiled, cannot be so straightforwardly undermined. And the threads sit beneath this denuded keffiyeh, sort of like hair, reminding us of the body, vulnerable, intimate, and enduring behind the symbol. The last chapter of the exhibition tells a different story of embroidery after 1948. While embroidery was in the process of being politicized, it was also being commodified. Embroidery is rarely worn anymore on a day-to-day basis by women, except perhaps by those of the oldest generations, and is instead most visible as product, cushion, keyring, bag, wallet. The ones in this picture were mass-produced in China, but a great deal of Palestinian embroidered products today are made by NGOs, by women who work for charitable organizations. And the events of 1948 triggered the foundation of several important NGOs who used embroidery after the Nakba as a way of supporting women and providing them an immediate income. Embroidery became a commodity, shifting from a labor of love to just plain labor. These images from the archive of an NGO called In'ash al-Mukhayyam, who's still going in Beirut, founded in 1969, show the kind of embroidered product that they were making in the 1970s with Palestinian women in Lebanon's many refugee camps. And In'ash catered to a sort of well-to-do, upper-class local Beiruti market, as well as visitors and those in diaspora, using embroidery in the fashioning of a modern Palestinian woman, one who wore a green halter-neck dress in Beirut in the 70s and carried this little handbag. And crucially, or the reason I show these, is that it speaks to a very important shift that was happening, whereby now it was the privileged who could afford to wear Palestinian embroidery and perform Palestinian identity and solidarity on their bodies and in their homes. And women who were making embroidery could very rarely afford to keep what they made. Hundreds of embroidery producing organizations like this exist today. My first book in particular sort of analysed 100 of these and scrutinised the dynamics and ethics and the rhetoric of female empowerment specifically that most of these projects claim to create. Embroidery work is easy for NGOs to start because they don't really require infrastructure. Women on the whole don't need to be educated or indeed extensively trained. And women are paid by the piece, which means the faster they stitch, the quicker they earn. But if they're unable to work because a child or a parent is sick, they are of course not able to earn anything at a period where they may need it most. And this precarity is made worse by the fact that embroidery is ultimately a luxury product. It doesn't have a constant market. And women compete very much for commissions. When I was living in Beirut and the Syrian crisis was sort of heating up and lots of Syrian refugees were coming into Lebanon, some originally Palestinian themselves, others not. They were all, you had this market of women who could all embroider, struggling for a small pool of work. And women may receive just sort of 10 to 20% of the price of a garment or a product for what might have been weeks or months of work. And for many of the women we interviewed, I should say, who embroider for organisations all over the region, embroidery is, despite all this, an enormous source of pride. For me, it's vital that we think critically about embroidery's production because the financial and cultural value of tatreez, being refugee-made, is predicated on everything I described, that notion of empowerment, the politicisation of the practice. It's posited as a form of resistance to simply own it, while embedded in a capitalist model that's kind of underpinned by unethical and unsustainable labour and unequal access to knowledge. But the picture is nuanced, and I want to acknowledge that so many of the women we met were, enormously grateful for this work, proud of what they were doing, and felt this meaningful connection to their homeland through embroidery. But to end on a slightly, if not more uplifting note, then on a more dynamic, more active one, with two contemporary pieces in the show. The first of which is a new work by the artist Munir al-Salah, entitled Night Holes, which she made especially for the show. In this, she uses the familiar mass-produced textiles that are common as bed covers and blankets all over the Levant, and pierce their surface with these small holes that then she's kind of hemmed with thread, recalling this childhood memory of being frightened at night and unable to sleep during the Lebanese civil war, and her mother allowing her to rend small tears in her pajamas and then sewing them closed, kind of as an act of meditative distraction. And you see them here sort of suspended in the gallery like tents with their hole-marked surface feeling either like a, bullock-pocked ceiling or a sky full of stars. It's accompanied by the sounds of children singing lullabies in different languages and audio of sewing and knitting, speaking to the experience of refugees, of course, but indeed also to the modest comfort that we might find in needle and thread. And for me, this work returns us to a question at stake in the exhibition very much, which is about how embroidery remains this articulate, meaningful medium for artists today able to speak to conditions of the present. The very last slide is a dress by a woman called Raja Zia, an embroiderer we met in Selfit in Palestine. She's a professional embroiderer for NGOs, and this is a dress she made for herself to wear to her son's wedding in 2014. And Raja showed us how she takes inspiration for what she does from Pinterest and Facebook and sort of WhatsApp's ideas back and forth with her friends. And what I love about this dress, and the reason I like to end with it, is that there's technically nothing Palestinian about it. If you're a purist of these kinds of things, the all-over nature of the pattern, the motif itself, the use of colour, even the cut of the garment, are not necessarily typically historically Palestinian. And yet, of course, by virtue of being made by Raja, worn by her, this is as much a Palestinian embroidered dress as any of the 100-year-old garments that I showed at the beginning. So beyond the resistance movement of the 1970s or the First Intifada, beyond these visible moments of resistance work, I love that in the hands of Raja, of Munira, of others, embroidery constitutes a quiet resistance, a practice that's preserving itself and that continues to transform and evolve in line with the women who make it. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really incredible. I just really wanted to read Rafa Ali's poem before we kind of start. Just I felt, I don't know, there's something to actually do as more of a prayer than anything else. And you've all heard this before. So I start. If I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza will looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad, who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a story. I have to really congratulate you on an epic show. You know, my own practice is really about female spaces and resistance through immigration, and it's a great tie-up. Thank you, Robin and Shahid, for introducing me. And you know, I've been searching how to kind of interview you for this. And yeah, most TV anchors would normally ask, like, you know, do you condemn anyone? It's not a question that so I'm not going to ask you that question, not sort of learning from the professionals. But, so my first question is really, do you think in this current climate, do you think this show would have survived or surfaced even a post-7 October climate? You know, institutions have pulled shows, events, with Palestinian content, or do you think fashion clothes is a soft kind of like a backdoor conversation? It's a lesser threat than a literature event or a conference? And what sort of reactions have you had, negative, in sense of censorship, and where, you know, have you had any? I mean, it'd be quite interesting. I think I know. Hopefully, I mean, I'm very open about sort of. When people say strange things to me, but I mean, hopefully you can be as candid. I know. So I was just trying to sort of explore, do you think this show firstly would have happened in a post-7 October sort of scenario? I mean, it started in July. And what do you, I mean, any sort of like, anything that you want to add or anything?
Yeah.
Anyone you want to shame? Like, this is the moment. It's not recorded. Is it recorded?
No, I mean, I can't know what would have happened had this been scheduled to open on the 10th of October. I think it would have been potentially a very different thing. We're incredibly fortunate that it was open already and that nothing changed, either at Kettle's Yard or indeed at the Whitworth itself. The Whitworth, an institution with its own enormous sort of traumatic experience of censorship, of mishandling Palestinian issues and exhibitions. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the events that happened with forensic architecture, and indeed with the ousting of their former director, Alistair Hudson. So that it happened there without anything changing, I think, is testament to the commitment of those who were part of the project. It came to the UK because the director of Kettle's Yard, Andrew Nairn, saw the exhibition in Palestine in 2018 and wanted to bring it to the UK. He just felt sort of like this was a powerful show, and despite not really being kind of what Kettle's Yard tends to do. And it was meant to open in the summer of 2020. You can imagine why it didn't. And so it would have been so easy for this to fall off the roster at Kettle's Yard and the Whitworth, because it just kept being like pushed down the road in that post-COVID scheduling that museums and institutions were doing. At several points they could have said, you know what, Rachel, things have changed, you know, we're not going to do it. And no one did, really. Instead, all the lenders, those relationships at Kettle's Yard, at the Whitworth, through changing staff and teams, like stayed with the trouble and the challenges of it. And I think that's really testament to how at least those institutions are thinking about it, or Andrew is thinking about it. But whenever you do shows like this, I inevitably find myself doing way more work with the board, with the marketing team, with the PR, with press, thinking. You're constantly anticipating anything that you might, what you'll have thrown at you, the Zionist Brigade, Lawyers for Israel, UK Lawyers for Israel, which are like two people behind a computer screen, I think, but which feel like a big institution when they're kind of coming at you. And, so you do a different level of labour to get a museum's or an institution's board on board and on side and familiar with the language. I had to defend my language in a much stronger way, and nobody censored anything. None of that language changed, but I had to do more educating, or like the UN uses these words, so I think we can, etc.
But if you were gonna, I know that it's not coming back. Hopefully, you may do back to the UK.
May continue to travel globally.
But would you expand the narrative in a way? I mean, around kind of events, around literature, around how would you see that? Not that you would do anything different than you've already done. It's a finished baby, but maybe you would.
Well, I think it's a continually evolving baby. I was saying to Shahid, it's sort of this project that never dies because it's had these multiple iterations, and it's such a privilege to do this in the first place, and then to do it again each time, and to think about what to improve, how to evolve one's thinking curatorially. How can we make this encounter more powerful, more intimate, more meaningful in each scenario? And I think what I would certainly do, and something we're considering as the exhibition may travel onwards, is how to represent this current moment, and to bring and document the impact of the genocide in Gaza on material and cultural heritage as much as on human life, because that's a violence, that's a tool of genocide as well. We ran a big symposium as part of the show, and someone in the audience, actually, it was all virtual, you can watch it online if of interest, it was between the V&A and the Whitworth, and someone in the audience described or shared a story of how families sheltering in the Rafah Museum before it was totally destroyed were burning dresses to stay warm, and using them as like, what's the word? Not kindling, it's not wood, but as material that you can light. And that sort of one sentence is like floored me. So I think that would be something that the show has a responsibility to continue expanding, to think about.
I mean, I was very timely, and I was in Paris basically for the Disquiet show at the Palais Tokyo. I think that would be, it's an amazing, I don't know when it's on until I should really have my dates with me to say, but it's a beautiful show, and it really positions the struggle against a kind of global struggle, which is actually kind of...
It's amazing. And
I felt...
It's very powerful, and Christine Khoury and Rasha Salti, who are the curators of Past Disquiet, this exhibition. Just repeat the show's name. It's called Past Disquiet. And it's really about, the core of it is the International Art Exhibition for Palestine that happened in the 70s, I want to say 78, but I may be wrong about that. Thank you. And then the way that was sort of lost in Beirut, many of the objects or the artworks that no longer sort of survive. It's a bit mysterious, but it's about mapping this broader nexus of global solidarity through artists and design that mobilized around Palestine in the 70s and since. And I know Christine particularly very well from Lebanon, and our projects sort of unfold in a way in a similar trajectory, and so we very much, like, how their work really informs mine.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing I wanted to really, we've both just come back from Venice, where the Global South and indigenous artists have actually taken centre stage. Do you think the Palestinian cause is condemned to a place where the country just becomes a memory or novelty, just like many indigenous people, like Native Americans, and you see sort of like, because some of this show kind of reminded me of actually going into cowboys and Indians, kind of like a sort of Native American Indian, or that's the wrong word, basically Native American actually show, where you still have this continuous violence and injustice, and it carries on over generations, and we've seen this mass cultural genocide in Gaza, with all the institutions actually been completely annihilated. So it just becomes this sort of idea of tokenism, and it sort of occupies space in museums as just, that's okay. Somehow it legitimifies it in a way as well. And just connecting that with Venice, do you think it's a trend, a blip, or do you think we're going to go back into this sort of neoliberal driving seat of back to normality? It doesn't really matter as long as it's not on our front door.
I think business as usual is the contemporary art world's motor oil. I don't think the contemporary art machine or Venice is a place to necessarily change anything. And the sort of architecture, the machine of the Biennale itself, despite including lots of, yes, as you say, sort of underrepresented or indigenous artists and marginalised stories and narratives that go with them, in a way that's sort of important and good to see, is not, in my opinion, necessarily going to shift anything. But it is a period in time on the calendar where a lot of people in the art world come together in one place. And what I found inspiring was everything that happened outside of the architecture of the Biennale itself, right? The collateral events, things like Southwest Bank, this exhibition sort of organised with Hebron and allies in Art Allies, I think Palestine they're called. And Darj Asad had a lovely exhibition. There was a solo show by the Gazan artist Malak Matad. The Art Not Genocide Alliance were very active throughout and working with artists who sort of signed up to boycott, obviously the Israeli pavilion, but indeed other places, and holding these moments of protest in that space that I think were very important. The Freedom Boat, which was Artists Against Apartheid and Bidoon projects initiative with these readings for Palestine, like just outside the Jardini. The amount of people who were wearing a keffiyeh or a badge, I think that felt meaningful and powerful, even in the face of obviously a bigger machine that is so imbricated in, especially in Venice, in kind of national politics, right? The notion of national pavilions is sort of absurd in and of itself. So I think people did what they could in that moment in a manner that felt exciting. I think if you're working to that cause, but maybe other people in the audience who were there have a different take on it. I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, I mean, but just this idea of, I mean, I think your museums and what museums can actually do as a tool for change is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Whether, I mean, shows like this would have had appetite post October the 7th.
Definitely.
I'm on a committee at a major museum which would actually be seen as they kind of like pulled the show because they said they didn't have time to actually deal with it. But it's but I think but I just think we're just in a place of novelty where it becomes just. But I think there's a lot more can be done around shows like this, in the sense of like adding reading material, adding sort of like different events, adding more. But I think this is to close oneself to actual resistance through this needle is something which is just the centre of it all, and I think so much can actually be branched out. But anyway, that's my.
It's tricky though, isn't it? Because it's what phrase did you just use? That like it's a novelty.
Yeah.
Well, novelty or not, if organisations want to platform Palestinian voices, I think that's brilliant because,
but
as you say, a museum. Well, only because, as you say, the museum encounter is an opportunity, or at least this is how I see this show, as an opportunity for a place that people who have been so systematically and over many decades dehumanized to sort of understand a human element or a human history of this place, to meet people, to learn people's names, to see what they make, etc., and to come away with a more intimate understanding of a conflict that may just feel too abstract and big and scary to think about. But on the whole, I think the pendulum swings the other way. As you say, things are being cancelled. Institutions are risk-averse. Institutions are worried about normalisation.
Show is very important.
I'm not worried about normalisation.
Yeah, and that I mean, hopefully opens up doors for other kind of conversations. But just more in a general sort of conversation on fashion and appropriation. And again, novelty again. And it's this idea of these kaftan and Eastern shapes, which are kind of like very much a sort of the dress of a decade from the 60s, 70s kind of onwards. And this exoticism still kind of like continues. And even a few years back I saw, actually, as I normally do on the walking around Selfridges, there was a series of dresses in a sort of kafaya print. In a kafaya print basically, and kind of like summer dresses with little tops. And how do we kind of navigate these questions of identity and these symbols of resistance that become sort of commodified? Where does it become about sharing, and where is it appropriation?
It's a really good question and a tricky one. I think it's always about the integrity of the intention and the approach, and who is making something and who are they making it for. So a brand, I think I know the one you mean, I can't remember what they're called, cashing in on the sort of visibility and associations of resistance with the keffiyeh to make like summer dresses for, there's a brand that really made them and sold them in Israel for Israelis to like dance about on the beach in Tel Aviv with. It's obviously appropriating and doing something awful. In other cases, like as I described with the work of NGOs, it's maybe more, not that appropriation is an issue there, but I think that the situation is always complex when it comes to the production of traditional material by the hands of those that don't get to afford to own it. So that has its own ethics. And in fashion in general, I think something that I find more troubling generally is maybe that big designers from the global north can look at anything, can like decide today to look at Ming China and for their next collection to go to Mexico and be inspired by whatever. But designers from the global south are often expected to perform their own heritage in order to be accepted or legitimized on a global fashion stage, and that tradition is expected to be something that they engage with. Whereas, why can't a designer from Nairobi be interested in K-pop and making work because of it? And this is all front of mind because curating a biennial of fashion on this very subject, but I think these are urgent questions that sort of intersect what you're asking.
Okay. The other thing is that I think just to it'd be quite, I haven't done any research on it, but I'd love to know if you know anything. Are there any shared kind of Jewish-Palestinian histories with regards to kind of like dress?
Absolutely.
That would be something to actually kind of open up. I don't know if you can were regional sort of like patterns, were they shared across sort of Muslim, Christian,
and
Jewish, basically, Druze,
so embroidery was really more about where you were from, not your religious background. So women would wear embroidery, like in Bethlehem, for instance, it's a good example. So the cross, for obvious reasons, looms large in Bethlehemite embroidery, but Muslim women would wear this too, not really as a cross saying anything about their religion, but because it shows they're from Bethlehem. And so the same was true for Jewish Palestinians, for Durzi Palestinians. It really cut across those lines. And I'm not I don't know enough or a lot about Palestinian jewelry. My colleague at the Palestinian Museum, Bahajabe, knows a lot about this and has done this amazing work on the Tawfiq Kanan collection in Palestine of jewelry and of talismans. It's an amazing collection. And something I found interesting learning a bit about that from him is that you would often carry sort of little charms or talismanic objects on your person, on the body, and these could be kind of activated by someone religious signing them for you or like writing something down. But it could be anyone. Like you could find your local priest, your local rabbi, your local whoever, and
goes on.
You're sharing exactly.
In Birmingham, actually.
So this too cuts across religious lines or meaning, and instead is really about community and local identity.
And just lastly, I think before we open up to the questions, when we're all out on the streets kind of marching, do you think, what we see is kind of horrific, and kind of life-changing in many ways. But I mean, for me, I think we're kind of seeing a kind of Diana, a kind of grief moment equivalent of what happened in the 90s, where you have a public sort of a public display of actually a need for change, or sort of politicians or politics that don't really represent us anymore. And I mean, I'm very hopeful that things will change in many ways, and I think those questions of novelty may not become novelty, but I think that's the only way that I can, something that doesn't affect me, I can still go to sleep at night, sit on my sofa, watch some TV or not, or read a book. I'm kind of safe. But I think I still will go out and actually resist in a way, or actually bear witness. I mean, I think I can only see that as a kind of, I try and digest it and see it as a collective grief of many things which are wrong in our society. And I was just wondering what you may think of that.
I try and remain hopeful of change in our lifetime, or even in the immediate. I think certainly those marches are incredibly inspiring, and what is always challenging for anyone who's done any political activism, as they will know, is sort of staying with the struggle beyond that first, because it's such exhausting labour, and it's such hard work, and it's so depleting emotionally and physically and all the rest. And so to see continued numbers come out time and again, to see initiatives like this, of groups like Unsettled Subjects coming together to build support structures that enable that continuation, that I think is amazing, because for instance, those who are leading like Black Lives Matter and anti-racism movements over again must feel like this, we come back to this time and time again, and we have the same conversations years and years. And I think with Palestine it can be similar, and this time maybe this time will be different, and there's a sort of, we're not going to stop. This is the moment to push through, to force political change. Like, if apartheid could end in South Africa, apartheid can end in Palestine, and I'm hopeful that this is part of that moment.
Let's hope.
Shall we open up to the audience? This is a beautiful sort of thought to end your conversation, and maybe we can.
Just to let you know that the questions aren't recorded, so
Okay.
don't worry.
But the other stuff was.
Yeah.
But you can decide whether you want to release it or not.
Okay,
you
that's
know,
fine.
Don't worry.
It's not long.
Hi, so first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us. I can say we're not being recorded. We've seen a degree of censorship here at the portal with speaking up about solidarity with Palestine, so I'm really happy to see people still coming and talking about it here. I'm grateful for that. But I just wanted to ask, thinking about this as an ongoing movement, do you have any plans for what you're going to do next? Because I think you mentioned about maybe taking the exhibition elsewhere, but do you have any ideas for other exhibitions or other collaborations? Would you be able to share them with us?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think at the moment, I have a full-time job at the V&A. You're very kind to let me do this. And because I was contracted to do this before I even joined the museum, that was so long ago, they kind of let me do it. And then this biennial is another thing. And then, so at the moment, to be honest, touring material power or thinking about its continued evolution and transformation in other global contexts is probably at the core of that. But I think about my role at the V&A as one in which it's an opportunity to leverage the sort of modest power or opportunity I have in that institution to do things with Palestine or with Palestinian artists. So I'm actively collecting and acquiring more Palestinian embroidery for our collection through a wide range of really generous donations, but indeed sort of acquiring from collections or from people who offer us things too. And I'm curating a display of this material in our Gallery of Islamic Art for next April, alongside some of the work.
Full show.
No, it's only small. We have like
Okay.
one display case.
I was about to say that, and then you kind of. It needs a London home for it.
It does. It would be
needs a
amazing.
show, actually,
But I think
it
again,
needs a full show in London.
yeah, and at
We'll
the
write some letters.
let's campaign if anyone knows or can, it would be amazing. But this display is something, and we're acquiring indeed like the work by Aya Haider, those the embroideries on the like hoops. They're coming into our permanent collection and will be in that display. So that's something. I run a residency program, and at the moment we have with us the Palestinian artist Jumana Emil Aboud, who's going to be with us for a couple of years undertaking new research. I think you have an event, or you had an event with Dima Srouji. I was just coming up. She's amazing. I invited her to be a fellow with us for a year or so, and this triggered new work. So for me, there are making key acquisitions also of contemporary artists from Palestine, of political posters, of things like this, are sort of both quiet and hopefully
Not so quiet.
or not so quiet ways in which the V&A is a bigger institution that is also, risk averse, as many of these things are, can kind of show its support or do something internally. So maybe that's where my focus is next.
Thank you.
Listen to the question. Change institutions we're in.
Hi, I'm Donna. I'm actually from PSC, but I've got a background in textiles and handicrafts. I've worked with Women in Hebron Cooperative for about 11 years now.
Amazing.
And there's two parts of this. One of the problems we're having is when we're selling the products now, because as you were saying, the time it takes to make the products, they are expensive items. Talking minimum really £60 for a cushion cover on one side. So that's, but also you were saying earlier about the women getting paid and stuff. The way our cooperative works, we've got 200 women, is the joint finances. So it's not like paid per piece. If a woman has got a birth or something, that comes out of the cooperative funds. So for them, it's very much, it's an income for a lot of their husbands are either dead, in jail, or out of work. So it's not more, it's not a hobby type thing. I was just actually going to ask if you have any collab with the Palestinian history tapestry, which I saw recently, which is amazing, beautiful, because there's some quite modern pieces in that as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Donna, firstly, for providing more nuance around that. And it's great to know that there are, as indeed I did know, but I sort of was being perhaps a bit reductive in the lecture, in that, as you say, there are multiple models for organisations working with women, and the cooperative model in sort of mitigating a bit of that precarity, I guess, is excellent. And I think there are more and more doing that. My research was done a little while ago now, in sort of 2015, 16, 17, and indeed the economic situation in Lebanon particularly is so much worse now that inevitably things have changed, and as you say, so much of that work remains vital on several levels, economic and cultural and psychological. So my criticism comes sort of more from a macro point of view, but that's important to remember. The Palestine History Tapestry project is really amazing. This is based in Oxford and run by a woman called Jan Chalmers and a big team. We've been in touch over the years, but I've never worked with them directly, and would love to properly connect and meet and so on. But yeah, everyone should check out what they have on their website. I don't know if they show the tapestry anywhere.
It has been shown a couple of times in London. I've seen it. It's fantastic.
It's kind of like Bayo tapestry style, telling the story of Palestinian history from as far back as you can possibly go through to today, and an incredibly impressive and powerful project.
Question.
Hi, thank you for sharing your research. I was wondering if you could share any thoughts on UK collections of dress, Palestinian dress, example of British Museum whether you had considered any institutions as lending institutions for the show, particularly UK editions, and if not, why not? Perhaps some concerns about Provenance colonial issues and so on.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Certainly, yes, the provenance of collections at the V&A and at the British Museum, we have both very nice collections. The British Museum is perhaps even bigger and better, and places like National Museum Scotland have a really lovely collection too. Absolutely, those are sites that were where collections were acquired, not necessarily through sort of literal violence, as you find happens with lots of our collections, but normally given to us by people who have travelled in the Holy Land, or charitable organisations that have gone out to do good works, whatever that used to mean, in the early 20th century in Palestine, and then donated them to the V&A or the BM. So absolutely, that was one part of it. But to be honest, it was really because I felt it was so important that we work with Palestinian collections and Palestinian pieces from Palestine, partly because the lenders are people now I've known for a very long time and have really extraordinary items that you don't get in British collections, but also because in lending to us, we were borrowing not only the garments, but I think their expertise and their experience. You know, the people who collect, some of them really are legendary. Widad Kawar, who's the founder of tatreez, the Widad Kawar Home for Arab Dress, which is in Amman, is an extraordinary collector. She's probably the world's authority on embroidery. She spent her life really dedicated to collecting this material, and it was through her and with her that I learned so much about this. And many of the other collectors too are kind of so utterly invested in the political import of their collecting and what that means. And for me to go through the struggle and administrative, financial, bureaucratic, political problems is honestly so difficult to get things out of Palestine at the moment, or really at any time. But that was very important to do, and it was important to have our partners be from Palestine. And all those lenders came for the opening of the exhibition at Kettle's Yard, and it was a really beautiful moment. It's also very important to me that we show the dresses in the exhibition not behind glass, and that they feel like something that, if a Palestinian person comes to the show, as many did, that this wasn't something being museumified or made ethnographic, that didn't sit within that visual language, but rather you'll see the way that we displayed them, and this was even more sort of thoughtful in the shows in Palestine and Lebanon, that they really floated and felt embodied. They look amazing when they're on T-bars because you see the structure of the dress, but again, it's really a flattening ethnographic approach to them. And so to show them sort of in a way that resists the museumification, because they're a living, breathing, active history and heritage, was important. And if you borrow from the V&A and the BM, you are you're subject to much more stringent conservation rules and controls, and to things being underwritten by the government, insurance, GIS and stuff. So for several reasons that felt important.
Any embroidery in the Palestinian diaspora?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, all sorts of.
Is the diasporic experience revealed in that embroidery?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think yes, but maybe most of all, I see it in a kind of contemporary context. So especially as is happening, with everything that's happened since October 7th, more and more Palestinians in diaspora, I think, are inspired to pick up a needle as a form of resistance, of connection, of solidarity. But that has been happening for years and years. And people like the amazing Palestinian Authority, Wafa Ghnayem, who, if you don't know, you can follow her project Tatreez and Tea, but she's a big teacher of embroidery. She makes embroidery, and she's made pieces sort of alongside her mother and her sisters, really kind of documenting their experience of being Palestinian American in her case, or growing up in that context. And so I think the ways in which both artists and sort of embroidery enthusiasts and hobbyists in diaspora are taking up the craft as something vital and meaningful from a distance is where, yeah, absolutely, we're seeing that happen. All the more so when people are longing for a way to kind of reach out, to connect. Clothing is so familiar and universal and simple. I think people find connection in clothing, and this is an example of that.